Those are two of the prayers. One of them is the appointed collect that goes with the appointed epistle and gospel lesson for a communion service, a nuptial mass within the context of a wedding. The other is one of the, as you know, in a service of holy matrimony, there are no prayers of the people. There are set prayers and forms that go and are proper with the marriage rite itself. And that happens to be one of the prayers. That also happened to be the prayer in the church where I was sponsored for seminary. In addition to doing the birthday prayers, they would also invite couples celebrating an anniversary, and that was the prayer that was used to pray over the couples who were celebrating their anniversary in that either coming week or in the week which had just passed. But this is our sixth time together. We're looking at chapter 7 in Christopher West's book, and the title of this chapter is Marriage as a Human Sign of Divine Love. Marriage as a human sign of divine love. Now, I think all of us who have been up here teaching over the last couple of weeks have all stressed the importance of the fact that one of the things that we are celebrating, and one of the things John Paul II celebrates, and one of the things that we as a church celebrate, is the fact that we are bodily creatures and we were all created, as God said in Genesis chapter 1, very good. I think if you have one big takeaway from this overarching series is the fact that we are not dualists. The body is not bad, and to the exclusion saying that we only want to be spiritual creatures. That is one of the big takeaways. I want everyone to make sure that's not Christianity, that's Platonism. That's actually pagan thought, to think that all we are trying to do in this earthly life is escape it. Actually, that's more like Eastern religious thought as well. The notion that what we are experiencing here on earth, tapering over into Hinduism and Buddhism at this point in time, is merely an illusion. We just escape all of the bodily realities. That is not what God created us to be. He created us to be body and soul. Body and soul, with the spiritual dimension shaping the bodily dimension. And so we have society that has set up this notion of physical versus spiritual, whether it be from a religious point of view, this body bad, spirit good, or a la Hugh Hefner, the body is all there is. Gain all of the pleasure that you can get in this life. Because as we have heard, eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow what? We die. So that hedonistic line of thought says, grab all the gusto right now, because beyond this mortal life, we have nothing else. Now, I'm going to ask a question, and I know that we're all good Anglicans, so everyone is going to know the answer to this question. What is the definition of a sacrament? Say that full definition. Louder. Yes. A sacrament, as defined by the prayer book and the catechism, is an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. Two components. There's the outward and visible part, and then there's the inward and spiritual part. The outward and visible is what we talk about physical. And not to delve too deeply into just basic catechism class, we have, now there are two schools of thought on this. I happen to adopt 7 sacraments of the church. If you want to adopt 2 and 5 other sacraments, that's fine. But in the sacrament of Holy Communion, which we just celebrated, what's the outward and visible sign? Bread and wine. What's the inward and spiritual grace? Yes, ma'am, the body and blood of Christ. In baptism, what's the outward and visible sign? Water, what's the inward and spiritual grace? Salvation, forgiveness of sins, regeneration, incorporation into the church. All of those are the spiritual grace parts. Okay? I want to shift gears. The sacrament of holy matrimony. What is the outward and visible sign in matrimony? Okay, somebody said sex. Is that right? Did I hear that? Somebody said rings. What else? Huh? Somebody said it. There it is. The vows. Now, I will make one distinction between matrimony and the other 6 sacraments. The sacrament of matrimony, who is the minister of that sacrament? Who said that? Yes, the couple. The couple are the ministers of that sacrament. In communion and baptism, who is the minister? A bishop or a priest. At ordination or confirmation, who's the minister? The bishop. In matrimony, who are the ministers? The husband and the wife doing 2 separate things. Now, y'all said 3 different things that are outward and visible signs, and I would agree with all 3 of them. I would say 2 are elevated above the third, and I would say that the 2 primary outward and visible signs are the vows that the couple make both to God. Let me stop just a second. How many of you have attended a wedding service at an Anglican church or were married in an Anglican church? Either one. Okay. There are 2 moves that happen at the beginning of the service. When the bride and the groom process in and they make their declaration of intentions, which way are they facing? The altar. The altar, yes. And if you have a traditional procession, there is the father of the bride who is standing in between the bride and the groom at this point in time, or whoever is giving the bride away. Then when they make the vows, what happens? What do? They don't stay turned to the altar. What do? They turn and face each other. That's an important move. That's where the church's sacraments and sacramental rites and its liturgy speaks without saying anything. The liturgy is speaking without saying anything, having the couple turn and face each other. Yes, that is outward and visible sign number 1. Outward and visible sign number 2 is the actual physical consummation of that wedding on their wedding night. And I commented on the Christchurch Facebook page, and I was so glad to hear when Father Raoul was talking about matrimony and counseling couples before they got married. He said, if someone comes to me and they are cohabitating, I and the church will help you financially to live apart until you get married. It is that important. That needs to be stressed over and over and over again in our society, because cohabitation is prevalent these days, and we as a church need to say something about it. So, and again, the rings, historically, only 1 ring was given, not 2. Yeah. Historically, if you go back and look at any of the old prayer books, it only is the groom giving a ring to the bride. It was only in later prayer books and modernization to that rite that the giving of 2 rings was customary and what we are used to these days. But yes, we wear on our 4th finger a sign and a symbol that we are married. It means that we took vows, and it means that we consummated our marriage. Now, what is the inward and inward and spiritual grace of matrimony? I shouldn't have crickets now. Completeness, How does Jesus and how does Paul put it? Live according to God's command, and the man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall what? Become one flesh. So there are actually, the way I look at it, two inward and spiritual graces going on. It is the two becoming one, and it is also the representative of and embodying the mystical union between Christ and His church, borrowing Ephesians 5 language that I know Adam talked about last week. So, we have a physical and a spiritual part of matrimony. So how is marriage a human sign of divine love? That's what we're going to look at this morning. Now, we have a problem. The problem is that the physical side of things from our standpoint is gone wrong. It's marred. It has been tarnished by sin and the fall. But what are we called to do as Christians? We are called to come back, and we are called to go to our Redeemer. I think that was the first talk I spoke on a couple of weeks ago, the redemption of the body. And we have ways that we can do that. We have ways that we can do that within the church. It's called the sacraments, and we are called upon to avail of those sacraments. Two that are most important within marriage itself. Obviously, coming to communion regularly, availing yourself of the sacrament of Christ's body and blood as a married couple is huge. It's critical because what is a husband and wife? It is the smallest microcosm of the church. Because what is the church? It's made up of little bitty churches. And then when you have children, if God blesses you with children, then the husband and wife become the priestly character to raise and train their children in the Christian faith. But there is also a second sacrament of the church that I think married couples should avail themselves of as well. And that is the sacrament of confession. Sacramental confession within a marriage is huge. It is deeply important. I am not going to ask a question who has ever come to confession. It's not mine to ask, and it would be betraying priestly confidence. In Anglicanism, we have a nice phrase that says, all may, none must. Most people say some should, and I say most should. All may, none must, most should. Avail themselves of sacramental confession. Any of your priests will hear your confession at any time you ask them. We will stop what we are doing. If you come to us and say, I need for you to hear my confession, wham, all bets are off. Everything stops, and we will avail of that for you. So that is two things that married couples, and here's the other thing, there's the physical component of that. It's the physical aspect of you walking down the aisle together to receive communion, kneeling together. There is the physical part of receiving the absolution by the priest, being assured of God's forgiveness of your sins. And one of the things that we want to keep in mind through all of this is the fact that Thomas Aquinas said this most beautifully when he said, and this deals with the aspect of God does not abandon our physical nature. He does not just say, oh, well, they messed it up, therefore we'll scrap that and do something different. It's not like an artist who gets into a project and then doesn't like where it's going and discards it and just throws it away. God works through the physical to redeem it. Thomas Aquinas says that grace does not destroy nature, it perfects it. Grace does not destroy nature, it perfects it. Where can we see that embodied? most clearly besides Exodus chapter 3. Moses encountered a bush, and what happened? It was not consumed. It's an important aspect of what Thomas Aquinas was talking about and what we need to grasp more fully, that grace, God's work in our lives, doesn't destroy our nature, it perfects it. We heard in the sermon this morning, I've heard it told this way: I like to sin, God likes to forgive. That seems like a pretty good arrangement to me. But if we were at all listening in the sermon, what's the problem? We can't see that disfigured growth that's on the back of the tonsils. We can't see without deep investigation in what's going on. We've got to dig deeper, and that's what we are called to do. And one of the principal reasons why the physical union of husband and wife is the ultimate sign of this sacrament. The vows are pointing to the spiritual, and then the spiritual gives way to the physical. Does that make sense? The vows are basically saying, here is what we are going to do. And then in the marital union, it takes place. So, we have the exchange of vows and the consummation. Both are signs, but remember, they must be held together. We must be held together. It's not a practice that I've ever done, but in reading through this and teaching and reading about this more fully, it might be a good practice on our anniversaries to reread together the vows that we made on our wedding day. What would our weddings look like if we rehearsed those vows more and more and more? I'm going to go back and read for you. This is from the basis of all of our American prayer books have come from the 1662 English book. And I want you to hear, we've unfortunately through all of the American prayer books have kind of softened the language a little bit. So I'm going to let you hear what would have been read if you had gotten married prior to the 1789 American prayer book, or if you chose to use the 1662, which you certainly can. Here are the words that would have been said at the beginning of that service. Dearly beloved, we are gathered together here in the sight of God and in the face of this congregation to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony, which is an honorable estate, instituted of God in the time of man's innocency, signifying unto us the mystical union that is betwixt Christ and his church, which holy estate Christ adorned and beautified with his presence and first miracle that he wrought in Cana of Galilee, and is commended of St. Paul to be honorable among all men, and therefore is not by any to be enterprised, nor taken in hand unadvisedly, lightly, or wantonly. We're okay up to this point. Watch what happens next. To satisfy men's carnal lusts and appetites, like brute beasts that have no understanding. Wonder what the congregation would say if we inserted that into our marriage services. But reverently, discreetly, advisedly, soberly, and in the fear of God, duly considering the causes for which matrimony was ordained. Here is a spot right here that I'm just getting ready to read for you, where the 79 prayer book completely went off the chains as far as reordering the purpose and reason for which marriage was instituted. Look what the church said was first and foremost. I'll just reference what the 79 did in a moment. First, it was ordained for the procreation of children, to be brought up in the fear and nurture of the Lord and to the praise of his holy name. Secondly, it was ordained for a remedy against sin and to avoid fornication, that such persons as have not the gift of continency might marry and keep themselves undefiled members of Christ's body. Thirdly, it was ordained for the mutual society, help, and comfort that the one ought to have of the other, both in prosperity and adversity, into which holy estate these two persons come now to be joined. Therefore, if any man can show any just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace. Where do you think, so what was the first purpose for which matrimony was created, according to the historic prayer books? Children. Where do you think the 79 put children? Third. Yep, exactly. Don't tell me words don't matter. And don't tell me word order doesn't matter. Adam, does word order matter when making a deposition or making an argument? Absolutely it does. Theologically, they were sending a point. And so, that is, notice the difference in what is going on. Yet, some of the things in it are exactly contained in our current marriage service. But there are, and Christopher West hits on this quite well, and then Benedict XVI in his first papal encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, God is love, kind of hits this from two different directions. And I want to leave with you a couple of things that I want you to take away from this as far as what does marital love look like in relation to Christ-like love. Okay. There are four things that Christopher West highlights, and I think they're easy for you to remember, and I want this to be one of your takeaways. First of all, Christ's love for us is free. Christ's love for us is free. I have chosen to give my life away, and I freely choose to give it. That's Christ-like love. That then has to have its mirror image in our marital loves. Secondly, Christ-like love is total. Christ-like love is total. It is complete. There is nothing lacking. It is a total embodiment of what it means to give oneself away. The third one is Christ's love is faithful. What is Jesus' promise that he makes to his disciples before his ascension? Lo, I am with you till the end of the age. He is faithful from the beginning. He is faithful to the end. Christ, knowing that it was time for him to depart out of the world, loving his own, he loved them to the end, faithful from beginning to end. And finally, it is fruitful. It is fruitful. Jesus said, I came to bring you have life, that you might have life and have it in abundance. So, our marital love, mirroring Christ's love for us, is free, total, faithful, and fruitful. Benedict XVI, in his encyclical, says it along the same ways, except he just uses two attributes that I think encapsulates the whole. One, he says, and this is speaking strictly from a human, from a physical side, Christian marriage has two intentions. It is intended to be monogamous, therefore it is exclusive, and it is also meant to be lifelong, having that eternal quality to it. You see how those, Christopher West 4 and Benedict 2 kind of lay on top of each other. We could merge them together. But notice, our marriages are intended to be exclusive and eternal. Notice, is God's love not the exact same? It's exclusive. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, to the end that all that believe in him should not perish but have everlasting life. He loved us all individually. He loved us all uniquely. And then he also did it from the beginning of time. Going back to that fourth one of Christopher West's, and this is the point where I debated whether or not to say anything about this, but I think I am going to just insert this at this point. this is where notions of same-sex marriage fail. What did we say in the prologue of the 1662 marriage rite? The first and foremost reason for marriage is the procreation of children. Same-sex marriage naturally cannot do that. It cannot do that without tampering with the way God intended things to be. Now that's going to sound very harsh, but sometimes the truth is very harsh. Let me read for you a quote that I think is spectacular that Christopher West gives to give a little bit more meat to how human love, marital love, is to incarnate divine love. Jesus said, "Love one another as I have loved you." This new commandment of Jesus summarizes the very meaning of life. And then he goes on to ask this question: how does Christ love us? And then he answers it. He says, "This is my body given for you. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. These are the Lord's wedding vows offered to his bride at the Last Supper as a verbal expression of the language of his heart. Then, when he lay down on the marriage bed of the cross, he expressed the same covenant love without words through the language of his body. In this way, Christ superabundantly filled the spousal meaning of the body by showing us the end, what spousal love is, what it calls us to, what it demands of us, and through his resurrection, what it rewards those who, notwithstanding their own limitations, weaknesses, and sins, entrust themselves to God's grace and mercy and embrace the truth of spousal love with all their hearts. Wow. Wow. Christ, without words, lays himself down on the marriage bed of the cross. I found that to be powerful language. And then he says, loving his and showing us what that love looks like to the end. How many of you are familiar with the branch of theology known as teleology? Is that word, anybody ever heard that word before? Anybody? Adam, yeah. Teleology, it comes from the Greek word telos, which basically means the end for which something was created. You're looking for the ending. What were we created for? We know the answer to that question. We heard it in the sermon. To know God, to love God, and to enjoy him forever. That is why we were created. We were created for worship. That is the end of our human existence. That's the reason for which we were created. What do we hear every Good Friday? We always hear the words from John 19. The crucifixion narrative is told by John on Good Friday. John's the only one who records these words of Jesus. It is finished. It's interesting. The Greek word for that, I don't have it here, but it contains that Greek word telos. What does that mean theologically? It means that the very reason for which Jesus became incarnate was right there. That was the purpose for which he was given a body. I about said Jesus was created, so I'm glad that wasn't what I meant to say. That was the reason he became incarnate, was to suffer and die on the cross, and then, of course, to be raised again. And so he cries out at the very end, "It is finished. It is perfected." Or in other words, I have reached the purpose for which I have reached my ending. I have reached that point. And so, in the consummation, when husband and wife come together to consummate their marriage, the words in their vows then take on flesh. You have that word and flesh connection again, don't you? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was with God. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld His glory. The glory is of the only begotten, full of grace and truth. Word and flesh. Now, Jesus' Word becoming flesh is perfect. We are being made perfect. So, there was a question that was asked. I don't remember which week it was. Someone asked the question, why does it say that in the resurrection there will neither be marrying nor giving in marriage? I think that question came up. I don't remember if it was how it was answered. One of the reasons that we will not be married or given in marriage is because we are being prepared to be exclusively married to God. We are His spouse, and we are going to be married to Him. And that is what, and notice, that marriage to Him for all eternity is what? It is exclusive, monogamous, and it's eternal. That is why our earthly marriages have to bear that same image as well. And then West kind of concludes this chapter looking at two different books of the Bible, two stories in Scripture. One from the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon. Now, show of hands, how many of you have ever heard a sermon preached on the Song of Songs? Oh, you have? Really? I have never heard a sermon preached on the Song of Songs, and I can say, honestly, I've never preached a sermon on the Song of Songs either. Why not? Why do we not hear sermons preached on the Song of Songs? Believe it or not, there are more commentaries of the church fathers on the Song of Songs than any other book. Believe it or not. Why were the church fathers enamored with the Song of Songs? Why do you think? Any thoughts? How many of you know much about the Song of Songs just as a book? It's very short. I mean, what is it? What is the Song of Songs? It's a love song. It's a love song. Now, many within the church have allegorized that to turn it into, oh, well, that's just talking about the spiritual component of God and His love for His bride, the church. Now, that's true. Benedict XVI says, and Pope John Paul II before him says, we need to get back, as Adam said, I think, last Sunday, we need to get back to writing love songs again and poetry. It is poetry speaking about the marital union between a man and a woman. That is exactly what it is. It is sexual in nature. Why? Because God created sex and He declared it to be good. He declared it to be a part of our human nature. And He intended for us to enjoy it in the right context. And that's the big point that we miss. And what the Song of Songs does for us is it helps put together and puts the proper connection between the sacred and the sexual. The sacred and the sexual. One of the things that he keeps stressing over and over again, and I think it's an interesting part of that book, is the fact that when the man is speaking of his bride, he refers to her many times over as his bride, but he also precedes it with another word. He refers to her as his sister. My sister, my bride. Now, why would he do that? Why would he insert that word sister? Christopher West offers an explanation, and I think it's a good one. How many of us would be utterly repulsed to lust after our sibling? Yes, it should. You should be utterly repulsed to lust after your sister or your brother, depending on which sex you are. But he is also saying in this marital union, she becomes my sister in Christ. She becomes my spiritual sister in Him. And so he has that picture painted all throughout the book. Go and read it. It's only 8 chapters long. Go and read it this afternoon. It's good reading. And we do need to have more sermons preached on it. The other book that Christopher West speaks about is the book of Tobit, found in the Apocrypha, speaking about the marriage of his son and his bride. Now, what's interesting about this is Tobias's bride has already been married 7 times. And all 7 of her husbands die before the marriage is consummated. Talk about an odd story, and talking about and of course, you rolling along to be number 8, things don't look very good for you. Believe it or not, before they get married, the father of the bride is already digging Tobias's grave. But Tobit has gone through adversity. He is much like a Job character, but they get to the point of consummating their marriage. Tobias does something unique. He asks her to pray with him together, that their life would be fruitful, that their life would image God's goodness, and that it would look like what the purpose for which they were created. There's the difference. And so what West does, and I think it's an interesting, cross-section. You have the Song of Songs, which is very sexual, celebrating marital love. And then you have the book of Tobit that speaks of hardship, of trouble, of pain. And he says, we've got to hold those two together. Show of hands, how many marriages are perfect? No problems, no issues, no heartbreak, no nothing. If you raise your hand, I want to see you after class. What causes us to keep going? What causes us to persevere? What causes us to strive, even in the midst of the hardest of hard things to happen to us? What causes us to keep going? Okay, perfect. Your vows? Excellent. Hope? What else? Love. What kind of love? Let me tell you, if it's purely sexual love within a marriage, your marriage will not last. I will bet you all the money I have in my pocket right now that your marriage will not last if all it is built on is sexual love. It also cannot be built purely on spiritual love either, can it? How many of you have ever heard the phrase, he's so spiritually minded, he's no earthly good? We're called to live in this world, and we're called to live in it together. And so thus, we have those two opposites that speak to one another. We have the physical good and the physical bad coexist together, do they not? I know many here have been through major struggles in your life. I know of them just hearing them. But you're still here. You're still here saying your prayers. You're still here faithful in worship. You're still faithful in your marriage. Because you recognize that God has not abandoned you, and therefore you are not going to abandon your spouse. And sometimes, Harold Kushner's book is okay to a point why bad things happen to good people. The unfortunate problem is it's why bad things happen to bad people. We're not, Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Why do you call me good? There's no one good but God. We have a world marred with sin, and physical evils happen all the time. Thomas Aquinas also makes this statement. He says, some evils happen in order that a greater good may come from it. How many of you have walked through incredible crucibles where you thought your faith was shaken to the core, only to come through on the other side and to look back and go, a greater good came out of that? Now, you may be still sitting there saying, I'm waiting for that greater good. And to that I say, keep waiting. Keep waiting. Don't give up. But many will look back and go, I would have never had this growth opportunity had this not happened to me. We've got 5 minutes left. I want to stop and just see what kind of questions we have on this topic of marriage being a human side of divine love. I hope I gave you something to chew on and something to think about in the weeks and days ahead. Any comments or questions or thoughts? Grab this in case. Anybody? Don't tell me I so adequately covered it that there are no questions. Or am I the dam that's keeping you back from lunch? Either one. Oh, wow. I think that's an incredibly good exercise. The only caution, and I think it's an exceptional exercise. Now, you don't mean he wasn't going to say them in advance, or were they going to have to say it from memory with no prompt whatsoever? Because I would say I think having them memorize them is a worthy thing to do. I think you're setting them up to fail in the moment if you don't prompt them. Okay, yes, but the thing is everybody knows about memorization. What does memorization do? It helps become habit forming when you say it and repeat it over and over and over. Yeah, good point. What else? Anything else? Yes. No, not at all. Not at all. Certainly, there are obvious physical limitations as we all get older. There are physical reasons why either. Now, of course, you could also extrapolate that back. What about one spouse or both not being able to physically have children? It's a great question. Does that mean that their marriages are invalid? Absolutely not. What it means is that you coming into it are at least open to the possibility that if God works miraculously, and guess what? How old was Sarah? God can work miracles now. God can work miracles. Yeah, Adam. Yeah, right. Yeah. Does that help? I mean, is that that's a huge question. We're right at 12, and I will just say, if I ever have a couple who come to me in premarital counseling and say, I want to get married in this church, and the first question I say is, what is your thought on children? And their answer to me is, we never have any intention of ever having any children, then I will say, you've got the wrong priest. Because at that point in time, you're making a mockery of the vows that you're getting ready to take as husband and wife. Again, another harsh statement, but if you look at me in the eyes and say, we have no intention whatsoever, there it is, intentionality. We have no intention of having children. You may, and it's okay to say, I don't know that we're ready for children right now. That's fine. But to close the door, remember what C.S. Lewis says. In the end, there will be two types of people. There will be those that say to God, thy will be done. And there will be those to whom God says to them, thy will be done. That's what's going on in the closing the door to not at least being open to it. Then that's something to explore a little further before I just close the door. But yes, I mean, it may be there may be other issues surrounding that, absolutely. But to just all chips on the table, and they say, nah, if it's kids aren't for us, that's what I'm getting at. That's what I'm getting at. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Direct us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works, begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, obtain everlasting life. All this we ask through Jesus Christ our Lord.